Thank you again for taking this to a new level. Now we had the big numbers for Europe and the big policy development that lies ahead or just in front of us. It's not far away. We now finalize the first slot of presenters, the first 3 presentations. And we now open for questions. So if you have questions to these very good and very clear presentations, you're welcome to step forward. Do you have a microphone, Sophie? Or shall you have one of them up here? Any questions? There must be things you want to know. Otherwise, I would start while you think about this. I would ask Sylvain the question. I guess it's a question for 1 million or something like that. When do you think all these new things will come true and be finished? Is it a long process or something we can foresee later this year, or what is that?
Well, it's working very good.
Yeah.
Well, as you guess, it's a process which is currently not fully defined because it will depend on the way the negotiations with the Council and the Parliament will develop. You may know that the presidency of the Council is very ambitious on the schedule. They wanted initially to deal with the whole energy efficiency part, which means the EPBD and the EPBD during their presidency. And the Parliament seems to have similar ambitions. And the current schedule, I've seen, leads us to September. But again, this is very tentative.
Of course. So if you encourage people to go home and influence their politicians, it should be quite fast and not next year.
Yes, and not in August because the Parliament is not open.
Okay, that's fine. Questions? Or may I continue with a question for the Maltese cases? You showed, and they looked very nice, the buildings, and you can see the adaptation to the climate. I guess from looking that the Parliament building was probably quite expensive, but could you tell something about additional costs? Is it coming in at a high price, or is it affordable, especially the second part with the school?
Okay, well, so far the 2 case studies I focused on were in a way a bit particular, where one is the Parliament building, so the budget for a Parliament building is going to be more than the average building. And the second case study was a pilot project, so the idea was to test as much as we can and from it extract which are the most cost-effective measures and how to make it affordable. So that's part of the exercise, so it's where we want to head next. However, there are other projects that I didn't mention but would have a smaller degree, say less extensive building management system or automation on a smaller scale, which would make it more affordable. However, that's where we want to head.
Yeah. And as it's new technology, sometimes you have a learning curve where some of the first buildings will, of course, be more expensive because you don't know to do it right from the beginning and you learn during the process.
Yes, and that's the first reply we often get from clients, is that they would be a bit more hesitant because of the costs and because they are less familiar with certain systems.
Still no? Yeah, there was a question down there. Could we get a microphone down? Please introduce briefly yourself and then ask a question.
Hi, it's Nicolette McCullough for QP Management, a professional service firm in Malta. More often the case, we find it very difficult to actually promote and get stakeholders interested in actually building or implementing smart systems within their buildings. Frankly, because what they're really interested is the bottom line. What's going to cost them? So what we've actually asked many a times is, or actually looked for, is for funding from the European Commission or from externalities. And is there any provision from the European Commission or from any political organization that will actually look into providing funding for everybody else, so that everybody can actually have access into actually implementing these designs? And if there is, if it is actually bespoke, depending on the countries, because obviously funding for a larger country, certain brackets are going to obviously not, at least not tackle the brackets which Malta actually requires.
Well, yes, I agree that if we want to go in a certain direction, then we need to be assisted. So the funding needs to be directed in the right way. So we need to identify how we need to help the industry and make sure that the funds are used correctly. Whether we have any funds, that's not something I can reply now, unfortunately. I hope that answered your question, partly.
I would just like maybe to add something in relation to the proposal for an amended EPBD. You may have noticed, if you've read this proposal, I know it's a bit boring, but you should take a look at it. In Article 2, about the renovation strategies, there is a very strong focus on the issue of financing. And there is this so-called smart financing for smart building approach, which basically is about making sure that the investment will be released in the area of energy efficiency. Because our perception on this issue is that the behavior of the market is not really rational. There is a huge potential for savings. There is a huge potential for cost-effective measures everywhere in the EU, but renovation is still behind the target. And in order to give an impulsion to renovation, the proposal emphasizes the need to aggregate projects, to de-risk, which means to decrease the risk for investors, and also to better use the public funds. So with the combination of all these measures, we are pretty convinced that renovation will be heavily stimulated.
Yeah, Doris?
If I may also add something to this, I think one of the things also that we need to do is communicate not just the cost, but communicate the comfort. What does it bring the user at the end of the day? Because we're buying phones that cost a fortune, and we can do so much more than just call somebody up with it, which it was originally invented for. So we do this, and we spend that money because we think it's good and it's cool, and we have a lot of benefit from it. So I think it's a bit the same in buildings. It's not about the cost. It's also what does it bring for the user? Is there increased comfort? Can I also sell my electricity in the future to the market? We don't have the business models yet for that. So at the moment, I can't even communicate. I can communicate the comfort to people. I can say it's an increased comfort if you build energy efficient and smart. But I cannot communicate that it's a business because we don't have the business models in place yet. So I'm just not looking for the funding only. I think that's the initial trigger, but mainly also for a long-term and sustainable economical viewpoint on this, so that it's a business model and that is worth it.
Yeah, and I liked some elements which were stressed in the first two presentations in particular, that there were other elements that you took in when you started looking at this. It's the environment, the green, or it's the swimming facility in the school, and it's the other one. So once you start thinking smart buildings, you might think broader and say we should have a smarter lifestyle, or it's a kind of education of people. And maybe these secondary or tertiary, or what they are, benefits are more important for people than the first one. So do you have a further comment on that? Or
yeah, I think you're hitting the point. I think we will not reach people mainly over the cost. I think it's one part. We will reach them if you communicate them also in a simple way what it is about. It's also about comfort, it's about the environment, it's about long-term sustainability. But that's why I'm also looking for something that's clear and simple. If we just talk about smart and we communicate it in a very complicated way, I think we will not reach everybody.
Yeah. I think, Stefan, you had a little comment you wanted? No. You get the chance to speak in a
I'm the next one.
Yeah.
Well, if I can just make a comment along these lines, I fully agree that it is about selling smartness to the people. An important element in there is some sort of a certification. So people will buy a smart building, but who warrants that that is really a smart building? So I think that needs to be part of the legislation as well.
We have nearly caught up with time, so we still have the possibility of a question or two from the audience, if there is any. You're welcome with questions, and do we have one more down there? Yes?
Currently in Malta we have about 3 or 4 buildings which are currently LEED certified, and therefore that sort of warrants that there are international bodies actually certifying that there are certain smart buildings in Malta. But then, for example, we are light years behind, because we have real estate developers and investors, as well as marketers, that are actually selling property within, for example, LEED or BREEAM certified buildings without stating that it hasn't actually added any value towards the cost of the apartment or the cost of the property. So therefore, the investors and developers are saying, why then, develop something? Why spend more on my capex? Where, for example, obviously they're not seeing the long term of it. They're not seeing the added benefits in it. But here in Malta, we find we need to actually jump that first hurdle, and getting people to understand the tangible as well as non-tangible benefits on developing smart buildings.
Any comments?
Well, I think it's related to the answer that I was trying to make to the previous question. I don't think that existing certification certifies that buildings are smart. I think the proposal that the Commission has made for the update of the EPBD is really necessary, and it is then going to be necessary to have this smartness implemented in the new certification process.
Yeah, more question?
Good afternoon. My name is Rancic. I'm coming from my industry field. And we are having a problem, industry actually has a problem in this moment regarding the compatibility between the systems. In the United States, for example, there is an institution that is covering this kind of problems by developing and standardizing certain means of connections, in the way that if I buy the lamp from one manufacturer and then the air conditioning systems from the other manufacturer, they will be compatible. I don't think that we will have a lot of smart buildings if here in Europe we will not have somebody that will try to make the order on non-compatibility market. Because we are developing, we as a company, we are developing systems for light control since 2004. Until today, we couldn't be able to offer to our customers sensors that are not ours. That is a huge problem for our customers, because if I buy the system from one supplier, then I will have to continue to buy everything from that supplier. There is no answer that I will have to buy the system from that I can replace it with other supplier. If you think to push the smart buildings, then I think that first of all you have to standardize how to interconnect all the systems inside the building. So the question, I know that that shouldn't be the rule of the European Commission, but somebody has to do it. Otherwise, we will continue to pay 3 or 4 major players on the market, and installing the smart systems will cost a fortune. I can't afford to pay, for example, 100,000 euros air-conditioned systems and 100,000 euros connection to the smart building. It's out of mind.
Yeah, it's probably a place we need to learn from the computer industry that you need to have the same connections, some of the same system which is controlling. They learned it a lot themselves because that was the way they could sell their products in the long run. Are there any of the speakers that would like to respond to this?
Well, I have to say that the issue you are raising is clearly one hot issue. Interoperability is clearly one of the aspects in which we would like this smartness assessment to be reliable. And clearly we are, of course, in favor of being able to connect any kind of system to any kind of other system. There are standardization initiatives going on. It's not, of course, part of the scope of the EPBD itself. The EPBD makes a reference to standardization, but it's for the calculation of energy performance and mandate M480. But our intent is to carefully review the state of the art in this area, and communication infrastructures, interoperability, connectivity are clearly some aspects on which we want some feedback and on which we would like to have an impact.
Okay. Thank you. I think we will stop the Q&A.